This is the Nourished Brain podcast, where we explore the art and science of nutrition for brain health and mental well-being. The information provided in this podcast is for educational and informational purposes only and is not intended as medical advice. I'm your host, Sarah Thompson-Fajera. Let's get started. Today I'm breaking down the details of a new study titled Nonlinear Dose-Response Relationship between Dietary Inflammatory Index and Risk of Depression, a systematic review and meta-analysis. This review offers one of the most comprehensive looks to date at how the inflammatory potential of our diet, based off of a specific scoring tool called the Dietary Inflammatory Index, may influence depression risk. In recent years, there's been growing attention on the connection between what we eat and how we feel, especially considered through the lens of systemic or whole body inflammation. There's now this thought that chronic low-grade inflammation is a biological pathway that contributes to psychiatric conditions like depression and anxiety. And because diet is one of the most powerful modifiable drivers of inflammation, it's become more of a focus in research related to mental health. Now, we have already seen in the literature this connection between eating patterns that naturally lower inflammation, like the Mediterranean diet, how they are consistently linked with reduced risk of depression. But this tool, the Dietary Inflammatory Index, that was used in this analysis, the focus of this analysis, it was originally developed in 2009 and has been further refined since that time. This scoring tool incorporates 45 different food parameters, 36 of which are considered anti-inflammatory and 9 which are considered to be more pro-inflammatory. And together, these food parameters are used to generate a composite score of the diet's overall inflammatory potential. In the case of this tool, higher scores reflect more pro-inflammatory diets. So to think a little bit more about the study design, this paper used both a systematic review and a meta-analysis, which are really strong evidence synthesis tools. A systematic review, what it does is it gathers every identified study that addresses some specific research question. So in this case, how does the Dietary Inflammatory Index impact depression risk? And the systematic review will evaluate those studies using predefined criteria. Typically there's inclusion criteria, certain criteria around quality of studies, for example, and a meta-analysis, which this paper also used, then statistically combines the results of those studies to produce a single estimate that's based off of this whole body of literature as to whatever result it is that the analysis is looking at. So for this project, the authors initially found over 1,000 articles from scientific databases. And after they went through their screening, their quality assessment, only 43 studies made the final cut and were included in the final meta-analysis. Okay, so key findings. This is the good stuff. The results here were pretty interesting because those who had more pro-inflammatory diets based off of this DII score had a 53% higher risk of depression compared with those who were, based off this tool, eating more anti-inflammatory diets. the relationship was nonlinear, as you might have caught from the title. And what that means in this case is that when the DII scores were below 0, which again would correlate with more of an anti-inflammatory diet, there wasn't a significant additional reduction in depression risk. So if someone was including many more anti-inflammatory foods versus just a few, for example, there wasn't this, food by food additional reduction. But once the diet moved into the positive DII scoring, which again would be associated with more inflammatory eating patterns, even these modest increases in inflammatory food intake, they were linked to progressively higher depression risk. So again, 53% higher of depression for those with more pro-inflammatory diets compared with those eating more anti-inflammatory diets. Now, there were some limitations here with this analysis, even with the systematic review and meta-analysis, which again are really strong analysis tools. First of all, the inclusion criteria did specify that observational evidence was to be included. And of course, observational studies, they can't prove causation. There also were differences in the populations that were studied, the definitions of depression, methods used throughout the studies that were included in this final meta-analysis. Really common, of course, that would be the case. We can keep in mind that many of these studies would be relying on self-reported dietary data, and we can forget what we eat, right? So worth keeping in mind. But despite all of this, issues that I think are fairly common in nutrition research, because there was consistency across dozens of studies, that does strengthen the overall findings. And that's the benefit of looking at this whole group of studies versus just one at a time. So overall, what could this mean for brain health, for mental health? A possible clinical translation here could be that any effort to incorporate foods with anti-inflammatory properties, especially if those foods are chosen instead of foods that would score higher on DII, the positive inflammatory kinds of foods on DII, that could have some meaningful impact on mental health over time. And this certainly aligns this idea with so much of the research that's been published about inflammation's effect on our brain overall, our neurotransmitter, our brain chemical production and signaling, neuroplasticity, our brain's ability to create new connections, oxidative stress. So it really lines up with those ideas. And as takeaways, practical takeaways, keep in mind, if you're not familiar with the DII, that many of the food components that are anti-inflammatory are going to be found in colorful vegetables and fruits, herbs and spices, omega-3 rich foods. So shifting your diet toward these food choices versus ultra-processed foods or foods that are high in saturated fats, which is one of the components that's more inflammatory, shifting your diet in this way could be a meaningful step toward protecting long-term brain health. So thanks for joining. If you enjoyed this summary, please check the episode description for a link to subscribe to the Brain Food Digest newsletter, a free newsletter where I publish some of the latest evidence around nutrition and brain health so that you can stay up to date. Until next time. Thank you for listening to the Nourished Brain podcast. If today's episode inspired you, I'd love for you to subscribe, leave a review, or share it with someone who could use it. Until next time, stay curious, stay grounded, and stay nourished.